heard Will already, then I'm sorry for you, and you're in for a treat today, because he's part of our Transitions Academy we had last year. He also presented a part 1 session for us last fall, and that session is archived on the ICAPS website, so that is available for you. This session today will also be recorded and archived as well. And this session is brought to you in partnership from the Southern Illinois Professional Development Center. I'm Sarah Goldhammer here with Bevan Gibson, our director.
Good morning.
Did y'all hear Bevan? Say it loud, Bevan.
Good morning.
And we're also in partnership with ICSPS, which is the Illinois Specialized Center for Specialized Professional Support, and we're both funded through the Illinois Community College Board. There is one handout for the session today, and it is under the handout section. Also, it was emailed to all participants this morning. So if you want to go ahead and access that, I would encourage you to. Will's going to have an assignment for us later that you can make an application of what he's talking about. And if you have questions throughout, please put those in the question box, and we'll monitor that and make sure that Will gets a chance to answer your questions. I do also want to mention we have 2 additional webinars coming up. There's one on March 26th, Acceleration Strategies for ICAPS IETs, and our guest presenters will be Dan Deasy from College of DuPage, Matt Beaslin, and Chris McElroy from South Suburban College. After Will gets started, I'm going to put the information about that in the chat box, but you can register on the PD portal, the Excellence in Adult Ed portal. Training partnerships for ICAPS IETs will be our second webinar, April 30th. We'll have Michael Baker, from Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Laura Williams from Danville Area Community College, and Angela Lopez from the National ABLE Network. It's the Pilsen American Jobs Center up in the near west side of Chicago. So, and without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Will and let him get started on our topic of the day.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for your generous and warm welcome. And hello, friends and colleagues in our sister state of Illinois, Illinois and Washington, peanut butter and jelly. It's really great to be back here again with everybody. Some of you may have been at the Transitions Academy last year. Some of you may have been in the webinar that we did just a couple months ago that Sarah referenced, the part 1 of contextualization in ICAPS. This is part 2, so it's very much flows from that previous webinar. And so what we're going to do is begin with a short review of what we did last time. If you were there, it's been a little bit of time, and it might be nice to just kind of refresh your memory on what we did. And if you weren't, that will allow you to have the highlights of that session, so that will prep you for the focus of this. So again, that first part was really focused on how you contextualize outcomes and standards, which we'll review. Today is about, okay, you've got contextualized outcomes and standards. How do you build, what is your instructional and curricular design from that? How do you build from those integrated outcomes? So that is what we will be taking a look at today. Just a little bit more of background, as Sarah mentioned, so I can kind of let you know, for those of you who are new, who I am. In Washington State, I administer the IBEST program for the state, and then provide all of the kind of national training and technical assistance that we offer to states with other integrated education and training models like ICAPS in Illinois. And so I've been doing that for about 6 years now. And then really that pathway development, we're all about pathways right now in adult education, and really in education and workforce large scale. So as people build pathways, college and career pathways that lead to sustainable wage work and further education, we want to make sure that our adult education students are considered in the pathway design. That adult education is not something that's done off to the side, and then when you're all done with that, then you can go to a college program or a workforce training program. We want adult education students prepped and participating in those as early as possible, as early as we think that they can be successful when they show interest in that. And so this is really about how to do that well, to do that integration well. So with that said, let me roll us forward to the next slide. So like I said, we are going to review what it's like to align outcomes. So this is just a brief overview of the previous session. It begins with identifying the pathway course outcomes. So the course outcomes in your welding program, your medical assistant program, your other advanced manufacturing programs that you might have, your early childhood education programs, all of your workforce programs that you're looking at doing ICAPS in. Once you have the set of outcomes from that, what I call the pathway course, that's really the workforce course. Then I want to analyze how the standards in adult education, those English, math, adult education outcomes or standards, relate to the course outcomes. I want to select the appropriate English, math outcomes or adult education standards for contextualization to those course outcomes, and then revise wording as appropriate. If this sounds a little theoretical, no problem. We're going to break it down and show you what that looks like for each step. So I've got two columns here, and on the left-hand column, I've got pathway course outcomes. I've just highlighted that first one, create and manage files in a Windows environment, and we're just going to zero in on that outcome and say, okay, this is a business technology course, and one of the first things that we need to teach students how to do is to create and manage files in a Windows environment. And that was true before we did ICAPS or IBEST. That was just the course outcome in that course. When we come along with the ICAPS model, we're going to say, okay, we've got all of this work here that we do in adult education, and you'll see that this is one of the reading anchors from the College and Career Readiness Standards. And we want to think about what standards in adult education could really support and integrate with the course outcome in the workforce program. And of course, I've kind of done the work. This is the pie on the cooking show that's already been baked, and I'm pulling it out and saying, look how good this looks when it's all done. We're looking at level E and noticing that we have a standard here that says we want to teach students how to follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when doing all of these various things, whether that's carrying out an experiment, taking a measurement, or performing a technical task. And we say, okay, you know what? I think that that standard could really support and integrate with this outcome where we want students to learn to create and manage files in a Windows environment. So I'm pulling in that college and career readiness standard, and I'm saying that relates to that outcome. That outcome and that standard relate to each other. But you'll see that I've kind of grayed out and X'd out some text here. I can kind of really tighten that up, that standard, so that it really makes sense more just to the outcome. And so now, with it all cleaned up, here's what that final package looks like. Great, students need to create and manage files in a Windows environment. And in order to do that, in order to learn that and manage that effectively, students will have to follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when performing that technical task. That technical task is creating and managing files in a Windows environment. That's the technical task they're learning how to do. And as we're thinking about this as adult educators, I think about this for myself in my own personal life, that slowing down and saying, okay, I have an assignment here with a lot of steps to it. I need to preview the steps and make sure that I know where I'm going, just like reading a recipe. I don't want to just start with step 1 because I might get to step 3 and realize there was something that I needed to do that I didn't do, and now I'm halfway into my preparation for a meal and it's a mess, right? So kind of that same idea here. We're teaching students how to slow down, preview, read all the steps, and really think through what is my plan of action for how I'm going to successfully perform this technical task. So that's the role that adult education has to play in the workforce program. It's an improvement of the workforce program in many cases because one thought would be, okay, college students responsible for their own learning, I'm going to tell you that you need to learn how to create and manage files in a Windows environment, and I might demo that a little bit, and then I'm going to leave you to your own devices and see if you can figure that out. The adult education piece comes in and says, yeah, let's really help students break down assignments and know what those steps are. How do we look up words that we don't know? How to make sure we understand what's the criteria is, all of those types of things. So what you would do theoretically for an ICAPS course, if you're developing a new team taught course in ICAPS, you would really do this for every single outcome. So if there's 5 outcomes in a course, you would do this process 5 times. For each outcome, you would go to the college and career readiness standards and ask yourself, do that analysis of saying which standards make sense for these outcomes, which standards best support the student meeting the outcome. So I'll go back to the slide and just pause for a second and say that's kind of the very quick and dirty of what we did in the last webinar, is to break that down and look at that. This would be a good time to pause if you've gone through this material now, and if you're finding that you have any questions, or if anything that I said didn't quite make sense. So just kind of a commercial pause for any questions on this material.
I don't see any questions at this point, Will, so I think we're ready to go on.
Okay, great. As questions come up, even if you decide later, actually that didn't quite make sense, just pop them into that chat box according to Sarah's instructions, and we'll make sure those get answered. So that sets us up nicely for the next round. And now let's put ourselves into real life and say, let's imagine this scenario and say, okay, we've got our set of outcomes and we've got our set of standards that are integrated to those outcomes. We've now created that single set of outcomes, which WIOA actually requires for all integrated education and training programs like IBEST, like ICAPS. And so now we're really ready to really plan our instructional and our curricular design. What is this actually going to look like throughout the semester and in the class? So that is the part 2. It begins with 5 questions for instructional design. I really like the information on this slide, and I often say this isn't really specific necessarily to ICAPS or to team teaching. This is just a good reminder of kind of the flow of how course design happens. It really begins with the outcome. What do you want the student to be able to do? I refer to that as backward design. I'm really planning my course with those end of semester outcomes in mind. What do we want the student to be able to do? Once we've defined that, okay, we want students to create managed files in a Windows environment, and on, the rest of the outcomes in that course. We're now asking ourselves, what does the student need to know in order to do this well? Curriculum. Before I was really steeped in curricular and instructional design, I sometimes would kind of start with the curriculum. I'd sort of skip step 1 and say, okay, here's the textbook that I like, or here's the readings that I want my students to have, and we're going to just kind of start there. But I really like that. Let's start with that outcome. Let's make sure we know what we want our students to be able to do at the end of this course. And now let's think about what curriculum best supports the students' learning. So whether that's, going through and selecting textbooks, or I think increasingly looking at open educational resources and where are there free materials for students that we can develop and share with each other. So that's step 2. What does the student need to know in order to do this well? And that curriculum will certainly structure a large part of the course. Once we've got that nailed down, we look at the next step, which says what activity will facilitate the learning? In other words, how do we help students connect what they're learning from the curriculum to roll that up to an outcome where they're actually able to do something that we want them to be able to do, that's connected to successful completion of the course, moving on all the way up to employment. So what activity will facilitate the learning? What will we actually do in our class time together? I've got that listed as andragogy, which some folks refer to as adult learning. Most of us are familiar with the term pedagogy, but some feel that pedagogy really has K-12 connotations, or that that's really learning for children. And so they like the term andragogy because it privileges the fact that when we're teaching adults, even if we're teaching adults at a pre-college level, meaning that we are digging back into those K-12 standards through the college and career readiness standards, we're still treating adults as adult learners, and that can mean different techniques and different strategies for how they connect to the learning. It's certainly no hill to die on, so whether you use pedagogy or andragogy makes a little difference to me. But the idea there is that we're really thinking about what are we doing in our class time. The next step, step 4, is how does the student demonstrate the learning? How do we know that students are meeting the outcome, in other words. And so that's really looking at assessment. And really that should kind of say assignment / assessment, because when we're assessing a student, it's because we've given them an assignment, right? And so we've moved from like an in-class activity to help them connect to the material to an assignment that is usually going to have some out-of-class time, some studies, some research, some planning, some writing, those types of things. And then we're assessing that, whether that's a paper or a in-class demonstration or a presentation or group work or whatever that might be. Finally, that last step, which is very much tied to assessment, is how will I know the student has done this well? Or another way to say that would be, to what extent has the student met the outcome? And that's the criteria. You might think of that as kind of more grading. You know, has the student met expectations? Have they exceeded expectations? And so it's really kind of those categories for saying, you know, yes, they met it, but to what extent? Or no, they didn't meet it, and what else do they need to do to be able to meet that outcome? So that's a kind of a gold slide right there, those 5 questions for instructional design. And whether you were team teaching or solo teaching, I think those are really good questions to ask yourself as you're putting a course together. Of course, for ICAPS, the special relevance is that is team teaching. And so the idea there is that 2 instructors would be really working through this process together jointly. And that equates to what I call the cycle of team teaching, which is really the cycle of teaching with the word or the, I guess, prefix co in front of it. So you'll see there normally as a standalone teacher, I would plan my instruction, I would actually deliver or instruct, I would evaluate how well that worked. Do I like the results of my teaching methods? Do I see that my students are meeting those outcomes? And then the reflection piece is really, you know, what would I do different? Thinking about what worked, what didn't work. And then when I go to offer that course again, what am I doing to change that, to revise that, to help students even more? In the ICAPS model and the IBEST model, we're doing that together. We're thinking together about what is this instruction going to look like? We're delivering it together, maybe not 100% of the time, maybe 50% of the time, but we're still saying in that time when we're delivering that together, what does that look like? We're evaluating together our effectiveness. Okay, we planned this activity that we team taught, and how do we think it went? What's the feedback from students? What are our own observations? Those types of things. And then, of course, reflection. What could we change? What could we try next time? What could we do different? You can think of this as happening on a semester level, but you could also think of this as happening on kind of a modular level within a semester. You might be looking at this in 3-week chunks or in you know, other time periods of kind of units of learning to plan, to deliver, to evaluate, to reflect. So this cycle is something that could repeat several times in a semester. I also think of it as something that certainly happens from semester to semester as I modify my courses for kind of continuous improvement, taking in feedback on how things have gone. So with that kind of theory in mind, we're ready to dive into the nuts and bolts of what this looks like with some examples and hopefully a little bit of kind of question and conversation when we're done reviewing. So what we're going to do is the flow here is going to, we're going to look at an activity. So that's the idea of what do we actually do in the classroom, right? Drawing on what is our outcome, what is the curriculum, and then how do we engage students in learning. So we're going to review an integrated activity. Then we're going to review a couple examples of how do we move from an activity to actually giving students an assignment that we assess. So we're going to look at some examples of that. And then I'm going to give folks some kind of playground time to say, what can we imagine? Hopefully, my hope is that you've come here and you actually have a course in mind that you've built and are refining, or that you're maybe working on building for the first time. If that's not the case and you don't have kind of content with you, you can just continue to play with the example that I've given you for this, which is really kind of that business tech or that office tech course, which I think is relatable since we all do create and manage files in Windows environments. And so that's the flow of things. So let's get right into the activity. So I won't be projecting the handout, but as Sarah pointed out, it was provided to you ahead of time, and also I believe just emailed to you. And so I hope that you all have access to that, and you'll let us know if there's any questions about that. I'd like you to take a good 7 to 10 minutes. So there will be a little bit of radio silence, but I want people to have opportunity to review and reflect, to look at this handout, this file management activity, and just notice a couple things. I want you to notice how the integrated instruction provides the structure from which to plan activities. So it really is about those two teachers working together to plan this activity. And then to make any observations about how the team teaching draws on both content and on the basic skills instruction, because that's going to roll back to that integrated outcome of saying, how is the content instructor helping students meet that outcome? And how is the basic skills, the adult education instructor, scaffolding in that support to help the students with the learning? So we'll take some time. Please review that handout. Ideally, you're participating in this webinar with some other people. You're kind of doing it together, and you can have some conversation with each other about what you're noticing. If you're alone in a room, then you'll think in ink. You'll make some notes in a document, or if you printed this out just with ink, and you'll just kind of make some observations for yourself about what you're noticing. So if there's no questions, go ahead and take a look at that file management activity, and I'll check in kind of probably 5 to 7 minutes and just see where folks are at with that. Hello, I'm back. It looks like it's been about 7 minutes. And we have a couple options right here. You could write in your chat box, we need 2 more minutes if you're in the middle of some really great discussion. Or we could get a little shout back from folks on some observations they made, some discussions they had, some questions, things like that. So let's see where people are going.
Hey, Will, we did have one question I'm going to throw at you. Stacy wants to know, she's just curious, is the BTS 160 a computer class?
Yeah, that's a good clarification. It's essentially a computer class, yes, designed for people who are moving into probably office environments, office managers, office assistants, those types of things.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, good clarification. Thank you. I'll continue to wait a minute because it can take a little bit to get some thoughts out in chat and those kinds of things. It can depend on audience too. I'm not sure the full range of who I'm speaking with today, but if you're faculty and you've actually team taught, this might be interesting to see. Does this look like the kind of thing you've done? Is it giving you new ideas? If you're a program director or a dean, you might also be saying, yeah, does this resonate with what we've been trying to do with ICAPS? Those kinds of things.
So, Will, a couple of other clarification questions, or one other clarification question. Does that mean that T1 is the computer instructor and T2 would be the adult ed instructor?
I'm pretty sure. I'd actually have to go back to the activity to double check. Yes,
it does actually say that. I'm
okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Bevan's pointing at it on a pen with me.
So, good. Thank you,
okay.
Bevan.
And then an observation. And I know, so I just want to say, like, whenever you're reading this is all really good, but it's a lot to take in. So thank you very much to anybody who's asking clarifying questions. Please go ahead and do that. So observation, there's no indication of a time limit for the activity. Does it 15 minutes? Is it a whole class? Just maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is probably most of a class session if you're picturing a 50-minute session or an hour and a half with some other activities. But the idea here is that this is pretty introductory and it's targeted to students who maybe have not had a lot of computer exposure and even just the concept of file management. Two things to think about. One, older students who maybe really understand file management from the physical paper perspective, but haven't had experience translating that into a digital environment. Or conversely, younger students who recognize the digital environment, but don't know the old real world that it was based on, right? They've always been in that digital. And I think this activity is really trying to hit both student types. So it is something that you really would take some time with.
And, you know, just to build on what you said, Will, I really enjoyed this activity because, as you said, it connects the digital with the physical. And, you know, because I came up before digital, I totally understand the physical. So it's helpful to see that connection. I also think this would be a great foundational piece to talk about organization in like kind of a daily living kind of, I realize that's not an academic skill, but my goodness, what so many applications to life skills and life skills oftentimes are the same as work skills. So I like those connections. And let's see. So Stacy also said this is a great way to introduce students to the physical environment of file management. How soon after does the physical learning develop to the digital learning? Do you know that answer, Will?
That's a good question. I think that will be as we move forward, we'll see the assignment that builds on this, and that'll answer that question directly. So perfect.
All right.
Spot on.
Also, if I could just take care of a little housekeeping, Sandra has her hand up. I don't know, Sandra, are you able to put a question in the question box or the chat? If you can, that would be great.
Yeah, and as we're working on that, Sarah, again, to your point about the usefulness of this activity, I think this gets into, even if you were doing some prep in just adult ed, this is kind of digital literacy type stuff, and I think that this would be a great way to be teaching students tech skills as they are preparing entry into a wide range of programs. So there is
absolutely. Hey, I'm going to, Will, if it's okay with you, I'm going to try to unmute Sandra and see if she has a question for us. So Sandra, you have the floor if you are able to talk. Oh, and I'm sorry, Sandra, didn't mean to put you on the spot. Okay. Barbara, you also have a hand up, and I don't know if that's just a click. As you're trying out the cool buttons we have on our features here, if you can put, otherwise, if you can put something in the chat box for us, that'd be great. Well, I think if you want to go ahead and take us through, that would be great. And then we'll circle back with you, Barbara, if you have a question, because we definitely want to get all the questions answered.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so the idea here, sure, we've done this activity in class, we've taken our time with it. It's really introduced students to both, again, like that digital and that physical world. And here's where the rubber meets the road. We're going to give them assignments. It's going to be graded. We want to see how that uptake is and if they're learning this material. So you'll see this flow. It continues to always go back to that integrated outcome. So we've got an assignment here, create and manage files in a Windows environment, and follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when performing a technical task. So the assignment itself is really for students to create a set of folders that they will use for the whole class. So again, you can see that this would be an activity pretty early in the term in this course, really getting students used to the basics of file management. And again, in that digital world, where does that metaphor come from? It comes from the physical world of file management. And so students will create a set of folders for this class according to a specific instructor provided hierarchical structure. I'm not providing that structure to you. That would be yet another handout, but the idea is we would be coaching students very much like the end of the activity that you just saw in terms of kind of what's the parent folder and the subfolder and all of that stuff. So embedded in this assignment as well is that assessment piece. So we're saying, what are we really looking for here from students? Well, we want to see that the folder names are spelled correctly and that they match the model that was given to them. We want to see that the hierarchy of the structure matches the model so that we've got all our parent and sub stuff. We want to see that the folder sequencing is in proper numeric order, so it's organized according to the schema that was provided. And then we want to see that students in Washington State, we're working with Canvas as our learning management system, and we want to see that students were able to take a picture of their hierarchy, a screen capture of their hierarchy, and upload it to that assignment page. And then we've got the point values there. So one thing that I want you to notice here as you're thinking about assessment and really who does the assessment is, an open question, and I won't give you an answer, but two instructors can look at this and say, well, is this all one instructor's job to grade this? Is it all the other instructor's job? Or maybe we split this up. Maybe content instructor feels that they really want to work on the first two criteria and they want to assess that. And maybe the adult education instructor would assess the second two. I'm kind of just making that up. But the idea there is that as you work with an integrated outcome and standard and the assignment and assessment that flows from that, each instructor should be thinking about what their piece of assessment should be. I think it's important that we assess the adult ed side of the house. If we embed adult education through ICAPS or IBEST in these integrated classrooms, but then don't have any assessment that reflects the adult education content, the value is going to be less clear for the students. It might feel a little bit more like they've got a helper or a tutor, which is great. I love helpers and tutors. but we want to be clear that we really are teaching students in adult education standards that help them to be successful in college. And so we want that assessment piece to be there. The next slide is going to break content and go to a different content area. But it's important because I think it helps explore this assessment piece a little bit more in depth. They're actually a lot more in depth. So this is a big like slide with like a ton of content, a lot of words, but I'm going to break it down for you and show you what's really important about what I'm trying to show you. So this is from an early childhood education class. And this is a summative assessment. So it's coming at the end of, near the end of the semester. And it's like the big paper. And you'll probably see this does look like a writing rubric as you kind of get into the details. We've got 4 categories. Introduction and conclusion, which is really that kind of that first and last paragraph or first and last section of an essay. The observation tools and process, so what was used to kind of conduct that research piece, that qualitative research piece. The analysis, interpretation, and conclusion, which is really about the findings that the student made based on their observation, what conclusions they came to. And then the professional qualities of this essay, or I guess really this report. And that's really what we tend to think of as kind of this standard edited American English and MLA or APA conventions, those types of things. And then, so that's the, those are the, I guess, rows going down. And then the columns are just that's your criteria, right? The 5th step from our 5 questions for instructional design slide. Is this in the 0 to 17 points, which is kind of, you know, emerging, moving towards meeting that outcome? Is it in the 18 to 22 point range, which would be the very clearly it does meet and does so to a satisfactory degree? Or is it in that really exceeding, really excellent space, that 23 to 25 points? So you kind of have your 3 big categories. Now, again, I'm not showing you the actual assignment, which would be kind of a multi-page document and kind of a lot to digest. I'm really just showing you the assessment rubric for that assignment, but you can kind of picture what this assignment would be. It's a report that includes some research and some observations. Let's think now, again, coming back to the team teaching piece of who assesses what and what is the flow for this. I received this from an actual integrated early childhood education classroom. So this is very much a real document, as were all of the documents from the Office Tech example. And in what we have here is a setup where both instructors really have a very active role in assessing. The content instructor, the early childhood ed instructor, focuses on the first and the last, the middle 2 categories, the second and the third. Because if you think about the observation tools and process and then the analysis and the findings, you know, that's really content specific to early childhood education. And it makes sense that that instructor is really giving that expertise in those sections. So instructor A is really focused on providing feedback in those middle 2. If you think about introduction and conclusion and professional qualities, those are things that the co-instructor, the adult education instructor, can focus on because those are really writing standards. And those writing standards, while they will take on the flavor of whatever content there is, and there might be some specific fine-tuning there, a lot of the things that are true of introductions and conclusions and those professional qualities are going to be true across different industries, across different academic disciplines. So that writing instructor really focuses on the first and the last category. So what you're seeing there is that you might have 25 students in this classroom, and you might even have a mixed cohort. Some of them are the kind of adult ed ICAPS students. Some of them are students who were just normally enrolled in the class through more traditional metrics or more traditional enrollment. But both of them are getting the instruction from the co-teachers, and they're really getting feedback from 2 different perspectives, so that each paper has both sets of eyes, each looking for their different areas of expertise. So that's really a pretty in-depth example of what an integrated assignment can look like. Because that's a lot of information, it's a lot to digest. I want to, again, just kind of pause for a minute and give folks a chance to reflect, to maybe write in any questions or observations they have at this time, for really thinking about what does integrated instruction look like when it comes to assessment.
So, Will, while people are reflecting and writing, I will mention that we had a question, would the PowerPoint will be available? This is recorded and we will have it available on the ICAPS website. And is it okay, Will, if we share this with the group as well, the PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And I'm wondering if, since this was a very specific assignment that you got from a real live breathing teacher, if maybe you said there was a complex, a more complex document, is that just to help people kind of process what the whole the process is, process the process, do you think that teacher would be willing to share everything that went along with this particular assignment?
I would imagine so. I think if any of you in follow-up are saying, yeah, I'd like to get kind of a deeper dive into this, I could kind of reach out to that instructor and get that introduction set up. Absolutely. I think she'd be really open.
Yeah, if they would be willing to, I think that just helps to kind of get a real grip on of this.
Yeah, to get past the first taste and really get the full meal.
Correct. Yeah.
For sure.
Here is a question. Is it intentional in the second assignment example with the rubric to have 2 rows, including the conclusion, with one assigned by the content instructor and one by the adult education instructor?
Yeah, in fact, when I have worked with this information many times, and I usually say and didn't say, so great question. In that first category, I say it's the introduction and the written conclusion, like a conclusion as a writing thing. That when conclusion is mentioned in that third row, that's really like your thinking conclusion, like what result did I come to as a result of my analysis?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification.
Let's see. And you get a thank you from the asker of that question, Rebecca, as well. So we appreciate you taking the time to help us to thoroughly understand the information well.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for asking that.
Yeah, I think that's the end of the questions for right now.
Okay. So really the idea here then, and we can see how this goes and what people are interested in, again, with the idea that you maybe have some content that you're thinking about right now that's relevant, an ICAPS course that you're developing or improving, that you might actually think about what is an activity that you would like, that you're working on combining, or what is an assignment that you're working on combining. And that you would have a few minutes to reflect on some things that you're doing in your programs that you'd be willing to kind of share or maybe workshop or talk about in our remaining time here. If that's too theoretical, or if that's too next step and we want to just continue to think about the examples that we've generated together so far, then we can focus on that too. But I would like as much as possible to get to kind of hear some more feedback from what people are noticing, what they're thinking about. Is this spurring some new ideas or some excitement for some things that you can do in your programs that you either have up and running or are developing? Or even a plan. Sometimes you look at this and go, okay, now I see why we need to give our team teachers more planning time, because this really is pretty in-depth work when you look at integrating your assessments.
Okay, a couple of comments, Will. Carrie, thank you. I've been able to bring in the GED grading process into the CT classroom grading process using a rubric. So glad to hear that.
Great.
And another question for you. What do you think about the proportion of learning outcomes that should be aligned in the content course? Do you recommend that all outcomes be aligned to a college readiness standard and assessed in this way? Or do you think that only half must be aligned or somewhere in between?
That's a great question. I'll answer that from two perspectives. The first perspective is what we've been doing in IBES for many years, which is that every outcome would have a standard aligned to it. Now, one standard might align to more than one outcome, right? I don't know about you, but in my experience working with the college and career readiness standards, like there's certain go-to ones that you get a lot of bang for your buck, and you might find yourself going to those more than one time for an outcome. But the second piece of that answer, from the federal requirement perspective, your Title II Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Funds, it actually does require that you have a single set of outcomes for your IET or ICAPS program, so that that really is kind of a requirement that all of the outcomes would be integrated. Of course, I prefer the first answer because that's really more about the content and the learning than the requirement. And I do think that it's best if every outcome is supported by an adult education standard.
Thanks, Will. That looks like that is the comments that we have for right now.
Okay, so lots of kind of thinking and digesting this information. That's good.
Hey, Will, this is Bevan.
Hi.
What about, I know that you said that you align those outcomes. What about in the case of their labs? We've had comments from programs before going, how can I align content standards to the labs?
That's a good question. I would presume the lab time still would be relating to an outcome in some way. But I understand maybe that question is how much team teaching would you actually do in a lab? Is that kind of the question too?
Yeah, because they really don't do the labs as much, I don't think. They're more in the classroom setting.
Sure.
You know, they may observe in the lab, but for every once in a while. But one of the comments, I know that I've had it multiple times, so people saying, well, there's some things that may not, we may not be able to find a standard that actually aligns to it. What do they do in that event?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think in that event, I'd probably just find a way to make a note of that in my documentation to just say that this outcome. Gosh, it'd be good to see a really specific example of an outcome that doesn't have a standard that could align to it. I certainly understand the practical piece of that. Like when my welding instructor says, you know, I got 10 people right now with their masks on welding. Like there's not a role for adult education right now, and I totally get that. But I think sometimes it can be about, well, let's look at any difficulties that may have been had in reading the instructions to complete the weld, or maybe in interpreting. Maybe you got feedback from the content instructor on your weld and you have some clarifying questions about how to break that down, and the adult education instructor could come back to that. So that's probably like a communication standard. We sometimes think of speaking and listening as ESL standards or ELA standards, but I think they're for native speakers too. And so we might even look at how an adult ed instructor can support a student in communication with the content instructor about feedback. So, you know, I think there's always some room for that, even if it's not about that direct co-instruction at that time, where the student's learning could be supported by adult ed. But I don't know if I'm answering the question or talking around it.
And Carrie McGrath gave us a suggestion that maybe using the work skills, employability skills standards could apply.
There you go. That's
Thank
a great
you for
idea.
that suggestion, Carrie.
Out of the more academic stuff and more into that, again, life skills, but very relevant to work life skills.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Very good. All right, that's it for our comments and questions right now, Will.
Okay. Well, even though we have a few minutes to go, this is actually very similar to when we do this in sort of a training setting. The setup's pretty easy, and the work really comes in sitting down with those integrated outcomes and mapping this out. It does take quite a bit of time. So I understand that people are probably just kind of noticing and reflecting on that. So let me see if I have, yeah, I think just kind of for my piece for closing, I just want to encourage people to reach out to me as they start to take on this work and as questions emerge. Really, an open virtual door. You can email me any question, big or small. I can get on the phone with folks. I can have email conversations with folks. We can work it through your work, Sarah and Bevan. Any way that I can assist this piece of it, I'm happy to help.
Well, thank you very much for sharing, and that's a very generous offer that you are willing to have that open door policy. You know, we might want to fly out to Seattle to personally see you because we need to go see some warmer weather, something.
Yeah.
But
Like it.
but thank you very much. If anybody has any last questions, feel free to put those in. And as I said, this will be archived. It's recorded and archived. And so you can refer back to it, and we'll try and gather some more resources from Will to have as part of the package of this training opportunity. And there will be March 26th and April 30th are your next webinars. Okay, with not any other questions, do you have any final words for us, Will?
Yeah, you know, go forth and prosper. This is fantastic work. It's all hands on deck. It takes some time, but the results are there for students, which makes it worth it. So thank you for participating in this and for your willingness to really dive into the details of ICAPS is a great idea, but how do we make it come to life? And I'm trying to give you some suggestions and some ideas for how to really do the work of setting this up well. So thank you for
You've given us some great tools, and there's lots of people saying thanks to you right now. So I hope that all of those thanks are coming. You're feeling those.
Great.
But thank you for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and your resources, Will. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. I hope everyone has a great day.
You as well.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.